I keep seeing online arguments within feminist spaces and the feminists I follow talking about influencers like Bonnie Blue or the celebrities Sweeney and Sabrina Carpenter, and how some of them say that they're setting back women. The phrase of "they're setting back women" / feminism is the one I hear most surrounding these women, but I have my own personal grievances with that general phrase, and I would like to remind you all that these women are not activists, nor are they politicians. I'm not sure why Bonnie Blue gets brought up at all, because I don't think Bonnie has ever stated that she was ever for the girls. When her drama came up originally, I kept seeing so many women claim that people are defending Bonnie while they do hard labor, respectable jobs that don't find any riches or fame like she did. I can't believe capitalism doesn't favor the hard-working people that do respectable jobs instead of the people who take advantage of others. That doesn't sound like capitalism to me. But I also don't see anybody defending Bonnie. It's both men and women that openly hate her. But most men I saw mostly focused on her faults and how her behaviors reflect all women, while all the women focused on the 1,000 young men and how those young adults reflect on the behaviors of all men. Obviously, those takes were biased, so to give my own biased opinion, what if everyone is gross and weird? In a world where we have one really terrible Bonnie Blue that perpetuates the fetishization of freshly 18-year-olds, we have 1,000 desperate young men who are willing to do whatever she asks because they want to her. Who is worse, the gross and predatory one woman or the combination of 1,000 horny young men all put together? Pick your poison, because both got what they wanted and I feel grossed out by both of them. I don't feel bad for her and I don't feel bad for them. And I also don't feel bad for Sweeney, except she has made statements about feminism and I think how she's perceived by the public, which is very jarring to a lot of people, and I completely understand why. If you're unsure what I'm talking about, Sweeney is an A-list celebrity who has done mostly modeling and acting gigs, but she recently collaborated with Dr. Swaj and made a bar of soap that was advertised to be made from her actual bath water. The product immediately exploded and was incredibly successful in terms of money, but she faced a lot of criticism because why would she do this? As I said, Sweeney is an A-list celebrity, one of the most famous people in Hollywood, and she decides to put out a product that an irrelevant, previously internet famous e-girl already did. I heard that she's made statements on how she doesn't like being perceived as a sexual object, but I'm not entirely sure if that's true since it's just internet rumors. But she has critiqued fake feminism within the industry, which does seem to check out with a lot of widely known previous viewpoints of Hollywood. Insecure but famous and successful women competing with other insecure but famous and successful women, but covering it up so it's at least only behind their backs and not to their face and in front of an audience. How unlike the entertainment industry. But people have pointed out that this stunt seems very contradictory to her critique on the supposed fake idea of women supporting other women, since if you're for the girls supporting girls, you shouldn't pander your career to boys. Except I don't really care. This ad was weird, of course, and it appealed to the worst of her fans, but I also know that actual celebrities don't typically make these choices for themselves because they have huge teams of managers, publicists, brand strategists, and marketing executives advising them. I mean, I really doubt that Sydney wrote the line, "dirty little boys." Sydney likely had multiple people telling her that this collaboration would be profitable and on brand. The marketing team knew exactly what they were selling and to whom. Consumers knew exactly what they were buying and why. Sydney may have been the face of it, but she wasn't the only person making these very purposeful decisions about how to profit from this dynamic. I know it was a weird stunt and a very non-feminist one at that, but it's just annoying how it seems that everyone is blaming Sydney specifically, even when multiple people were involved in the process. Sydney could make perfect feminist choices for the rest of her career, but that wouldn't change the fact that this entertainment industry is built on commodifying women's bodies and sexuality, and her team is just taking advantage of that. And I know that the entire blame being put on Sydney is just purity culture, but in different feminist sounding light. It is an impossible standard that women's sexuality is celebrated for different conservative and progressive reasons, like reproduction and male pleasure, or having a comfortable, healthy relationship with one's own body. But also, they've ridiculed for expressing their sexuality the wrong way, like seeking the sexual approval of others, or their sexuality is just really scary from an outside perspective. Sabrina Carpenter recently released an image of the cover for her new album, Man's Best Friend, which shows her on her hands and knees while a man holds her hair, accompanied by another picture of a dog collar. I saw the outrage before I saw the actual pictures, and I was very underwhelmed by the actual picture of the cover, because not like she looks like she doesn't want to be there. She's not crying or bruised or trying to get away from him. Granted, it could just be my own mind normalizing this kind of interaction because of media that I've seen that have been far worse, but I also know that doesn't excuse the dent in the car when other cars have been totaled. The kind of feedback I've seen has been mostly about the cultural implications about the album cover, like people calling it as regressive, and that it reinforces stereotypes of women as pets, props, and possessions. It popularized the already heated debate behind BDSM within feminist spaces on whether it's empowering all women or whether it's degrading all women. I think the general problem comes from either demonizing her or putting her on a pedestal. When she performs seductively on stage, poses in suggestive positions, pretends to drop a towel, or wears lingerie during her sets, I saw it as a woman being risque for her own pleasure, and I never saw it as a broader message beyond that. These don't look like feminist or sex-positive manifestos to the social movements. They look like someone who simply enjoys being provocative on stage, whether that's for her personal desire or her team's creative direction. And from what I've seen, her audience of mainly women really like it too. I've watched her fans praise her for being so expressive with her sexuality without shame, celebrating her refusal to bow to the constant cultural nagging that tells women to cover up and keep their desires private. While I personally didn't find her performances as groundbreaking as others claimed, I never really saw any problem with them overall. But now that her style of music is creatively moving towards more risky sexual dynamics, she's facing a lot of backlash from her own fans because it's not okay to hit, choke, whip, and degrade women even during. Yes, that's true, but only if the women involved aren't allowed any autonomy. But then again, that becomes a slippery slope as well. If a woman is making the choice to be hit, choked, whipped, and degraded because someone else coerced her through many years of propaganda telling her that you must enjoy violent sex because that's what all men like, then no, it's not her actual choice at that point, because that's misogynistic, harmful rules being pushed onto women without their knowledge. I personally know the difference between fetishized sexually violent fiction and safe BDSM, but not everyone does, and people will take advantage of others who don't know that. When people are raised with the message that all sexuality is shameful or dangerous to discuss, they enter adulthood without the knowledge to distinguish between healthy sexual practices and harmful ones. They don't learn about concepts like enthusiastic consent, safe words, aftercare, or the differences between fantasy and reality, which can foster a really dangerous sexual headspace. But also telling women that their individualistic choices of consenting to performing a submissive role to her male counterpart where they practice risk-aware consensual kink is wrong, harmful to all women, and misogynistic also intersects with purity culture that's still harmful to all women and sexually misogynistic. Purity culture literally defines a woman by her virginity and shame, teaching her that questioning or enjoying her own sexual power is dangerous. Women are victims to people who claim their desires are a part of a kink culture when all they really want to do is hurt women, but they are not victims to people who respect their autonomy, their well-being, and their safety while being a part of the actual BDSM scene. But to be completely fair, I've also seen some people say that they're not against women having their own preferences in bed or in private, but that it shouldn't be an album cover, and I think that's the critique that I can actually find to be most valid, because some people just don't want to hear about celebrity sexual preferences, which I don't think is either rooted in conservatism or slut-shaming. But I don't find any connection to any of the other opinions surrounding this debate. For one, people who are opposed to the cover art has brought up the ages of her audience because even Sabrina knows how young her fans can get, which can influence her fans on how and relationships should look like. But I don't really care about the age of her audience because if they're too young to be exposed to that kind of thing but still see the cover, they'll also see the millions of other videos critiquing it. Most of the defenses that I've seen of this album cover is that it's supposed to be ironic or satire, like she's deliberately playing with hypersexualized tropes to subvert them, because people assume when it actually comes out it's going to make the man look pathetic and her in control instead. I don't care about that defense either because satire doesn't land if the people you're mocking agree with you. But I was still really on the fence with this debate because while I personally don't take issue with the cover, I fully understand why others do. The conversation around it is less about Sabrina herself and more about the complicated terrain of autonomy, performance, sexuality, and how these things get packaged and sold. Even if the artists do have full control of how that image looks, the way it's perceived and interpreted by the public still matters because it can reinforce or challenge dominant narratives about women and especially when Sabrina, or at least her team, seems very expressive in how little she is. I don't care about the adult man holding an adult woman's hair. I care about the fact that she compares herself to looking like a little girl all the time, supposedly as a reference to her height. I brushed off the pastel clothes and the short girl jokes means that she's sexualizing children comments because neither of those connect to children at all. But I did start paying more attention when I noticed how frequently Sabrina leans into language and imagery that eerily resembles media that are about little kids, or specifically the sexualization of young teenage girls to emphasize her littleness in a way that goes beyond just being a girly short girl. While I know that age play and littles can be super controversial even even within BDSM communities, I'm not actually trying to shame consensual adult kinks. At the end of the day, it's adults engaging in roleplay, and as long as everyone involved is informed, safe, and practicing with full consent and aware of the risks, it's not my place to judge. However, when those aesthetics cross over into mainstream media without the clear context of roleplay or intentional critique, the conversation doesn't just surround the idea of private kinks between consenting adults, because then it more so shifts into how certain signifiers of youth and innocence are repeatedly sexualized in public-facing art and advertising, often without acknowledging the baggage that comes with them. It's possible for images to be both someone's genuine expression of agency while also being a mirror of old, tired, creepy, and sexist power dynamics back from the 20th century. She recently posted a second alternative album cover that's approved by God, where she's in a black and white photo surrounded by a bunch of men seemingly at a public event while leaning on one of them. I recently learned that Sabrina has had a history of pissing off religious people, specifically when it comes to how open she is about her sexuality. There are a ton of podcasts, comments, social media threads critiquing every single sexual related thing she's ever done, and how surprising is it that you can always find that these conversations are either started or amplified by religious people calling her impure and inappropriate. The loudest voices on Sabrina Carpenter's entire career keep coming from conservative religious outlets, which switch literally every nuanced issue about sexual autonomy, consent, and artistic agency into an exhibition about religion versus sexuality. Sabrina's response doesn't seem to be addressing the valid BDSM positive/negative views or feminist criticism behind her work, because the voices that overshadow everyone are religious Puritan ones, which just makes it become the conversation. And then we have to do this entire dance again of reminding people that no one should care if a woman is raunchy. Guys, we cannot keep proving Sigmund Freud right, please. But again, I'd like to remind you that these women have only ever marketed themselves to be sexual, not as empowered feminists. It is other people who have called them feminist icons when they've literally done nothing for feminism. My feminism doesn't revolve around what an individual blonde white woman does sexually with her career. Thus, I don't treat that individual woman as representative of all women. These women's choices don't reflect on feminism any more than a male celebrity's choices reflect on all men. A woman's controversial choice does not always have to either advance or set back women as a group. The entertainment industry rewards women for their sexuality while simultaneously shaming them for leveraging it. Believe it or not, women won't always make good choices because they are people too. While I don't believe that their choices are feminist in the slightest, I also don't think that we should be asking individual famous blonde white women to solve systematic problems through their personal sexual choices and preferences, while the systems and structures that create these dynamics continue operating unchanged. I individually, wholeheartedly care about none of these women, but also isn't it a little weird that their sexual and controversial stunts involve either young people or just flat out children in some way, shape, or form? Sabrina compares herself to a little girl all the time, and her team had a photo shoot that mirrored the aesthetics of a movie quite literally highlighting pedophilia. Sydney's team made her add the word little when she was advertising to her dirty male customers, and Bonnie just openly expresses her fetish for barely legal men. I don't really like that all of these cases have become a case of if we give you an inch, we'll take a mile, because there is nothing wrong with any of these women being comfortable in her sexuality. I still don't care if a music artist wants to be seductive on stage, or even in their music, or if a person just enjoys intercourse with people relatively around their age, or if someone wants to sell a product no matter what gender, but the line of sexualization should stop at fetishizing minors/barely legal people, right? I know that people would still give these women even if they didn't do anything related to minors at all, but that's where I personally draw the line. But to be fair, sometimes people genuinely disagree on where that line is when it comes to what counts as childlike or child adjacent. For example, in the United States, the age of consent is most commonly 16, but personally, I don't think any respectable adult should be dating or being intimate with someone under the age of 18. Age gaps don't matter, but ages do. That's my boundary, not because the law specifically said so, but because there's an ethical gap between what's legal and what's appropriate. But then again, there's a continuous tendency online to accuse any woman who wears pastel, kawaii, or frilly fashion of trying to sexualize children. That assumption is just super reductive, and frankly, it low-key reveals more about the observer than the person wearing it. Just because someone prefers bows, hearts, or soft aesthetics doesn't mean they're inherently performing girlhood or infantilizing themselves for sexual attention. These styles exist across cultures as genuine self-expression, not as covert signals of sexual deviance. Especially when I see little girls girls wearing those styles, it's still considered inappropriate because adults project sexual meaning onto the style even when the style is originally rooted in context outside of sexualization. The observations are sometimes valid to my standards, and I'm sure your standards too, like when aesthetics are combined intentionally with sexual framing, baby voice performance, or youth-coded behavior in a context clearly meant to be seen as sexual, especially when those people conveniently have explicit content available to buy. But women who have a unique speaking pattern, high voice pitch, or liking cutesy clothing doesn't automatically mean they're role-playing a child. That kind of logic leads us right back to purity culture, where women's innocence or femininity is always under suspicion. Women must behave, dress, and express themselves in ways that avoid being perceived as sexually provocative, or else they're impure, shameful, or asking for it. I really love making all expressions of femininity about how others might interpret them, and then placing the burden of that interpretation on the women. Speaking of others' interpretations, I saw this post of a painter that I followed who posted this painting of a woman in a nightgown holding a candle, but it was laying down on a table, which made the proportions weird. And I thought that was pretty obvious because of how the canvas was obviously lying on a table. When I opened up the comments to see the support that I usually see on many artists' work, even on Instagram Reels, the top comments were, "The chest isn't properly proportioned. If you're gonna do realism, please know how it works. Men can't draw real women. Definitely drawn by a man." And I see these comments all the time on pieces of artwork of women. I typically don't care because I like looking at sexy stuff, but sometimes they're valid because incels like their female bodies catering to their fantasies instead of reality. But this time, it's not, because this woman is a real person. This painting was based off of a painting model, and all the comments are calling this painting of a real woman Gooner bait. I honestly don't take anybody who says gooner bait seriously because there's a difference between thinking it's pretty and thinking it's gooner bait. You know that political saying that sometimes you swing so far left you end up back on the right, or vice versa? Well, instead of the typical Puritan rant of women shouldn't be sexual because it's sinful, we now have supposedly progressive people saying that women shouldn't be depicted as sexual or attractive because it's objectifying. But the end result is the same, because a normal woman becomes something shameful that should be hidden or heavily regulated. Yes, this woman is conventional attractive in both face and body type, and the painting itself doesn't challenge any social issue. But that doesn't mean she's gooner bait just because she's a pretty woman, and it doesn't mean that the man is a terrible pervert for painting her. Every artist is different, and sometimes they have different intentions with their art. Sometimes it is truly men objectifying women to the point where it becomes damaging to both the audience consuming it and the perceived idea of women as a whole. But it's just so clear that this wasn't one of those instances. It's just modern progressive language that indirectly tells women that their bodies are at fault for being too erotic. No woman looks like that, but some women do. Some women have big breasts, and you can portray them in fiction without sexualizing them. But when people automatically assume that any depiction of an attractive woman is sexual, they're proving that women's bodies are perceived as inherently sexual regardless of context. No matter what progressive language you use, it's still regulating how women's bodies can be seen, depicted, and appreciated in public spaces. Feminism doesn't mean that we strip women of conventional desirability or sexuality just because men benefit from it by getting to see pretty women sometimes. I would like to think that most people view her quietly as a normal woman, progressives and conservatives alike, but these comments are just really loud, and for those being the top comments, it's just really disheartening to see how much weight they carry. These people don't seem like they're protecting women, it just seems like they're virtue signaling. I'm sure that all these people care about women, of course, but these comments just aren't proving it. These reactions don't reflect on the mind of a feminist, because wholeheartedly, this painting isn't sexualized at all. It's just a woman holding a candle, but the commenters are literally doing the exact same thing they accuse the artist of doing, which is sexualizing a normal woman. They're projecting sexual intent onto something that isn't inherently sexual, then blaming someone else for their own perception. Very similar to how someone with a warped mindset due to can't look at a woman's body without sexualizing it and then blaming the woman for having that body. These are two people that have very obvious different intentions, but they still end up seeing a sexualized version of a normal woman, and both pretend to be morally superior. So while I continue to pretend to be morally superior for complaining about both, I also want to complain about how people seem to forget that Puritan ideas ultimately fuel culture and vice versa. I've always had a hard time addressing purity culture as a whole because I don't want to say that having limits on what you want for yourself sexually is bad when it's obviously not. If people are happy being modest, participating in abstinence, and just centering their sexual lives around Jesus, the Bible, and for some reason other religious people, then sure, who am I to judge if they want to do that for themselves? There's nothing wrong with modesty in itself, just like there's nothing wrong with being religious in itself. But the broader cultural implications of both just always remind me that people weaponize those ideas to force other people to do or act certain ways just for religious reasons, which feed into myths. Not all religious people, obviously, but it's enough that it fuels an entire culture of social norms and taboos. Someone can personally choose abstinence while also supporting comprehensive sex education for others, but that requires separating their personal religious convictions with their views on public policy, which is something very difficult for people whose faith informs their entire worldview. Like the very common religious idea that you can prevent rape simply by being modest, covered up, quiet, and reserved, that if something bad happens to you, it must mean you weren't well behaved enough, which mostly, directly, harms women or the idea of women. So when cultures revolve around one specific religion's beliefs over facts and logic, it shows up as a response to real victims in courtrooms, in schools, and media coverages of survivors. Purity culture is rightly criticized by many progressives because of how much harm it has perpetuated in the last however many years. But what I've personally noticed is that well-deserved criticism of purity culture has also created a kind of automatic backlash against any boundaries or critiques around how sex is portrayed, even when those critiques aren't coming from a place of religious control or shame. When I looked up more opinions about the game No Mercy, which, to recap, No Mercy is a visual novel where the goal is to violently blackmail and beat women under the guise of punishment and domination and then rewards you for it. I kept seeing mostly negative feedback where men, women, queers, heteros, and sex-positive people voiced valid concerns around the concept of the game, not just because it contained and violence as much as people want to bring up unrelated psychological horrors in shonen, but because the game seems to trivialize and gamify it. I saw most people say that it shouldn't exist at all because it re-traumatizes survivors, normalizes violent behavior, and offers no ethical framework for handling such extreme content within the game. But a couple criticism that I saw against those statements besides just, you're a woke f***ing feminist, and your opinion doesn't matter, were, you sound like one of those Christian nationalists, which I thought was really interesting. The incel dismissing feminists don't matter because they sound stupid always. But what's more stupid is the connection back to religious figures or ideals when it comes to censorship, no matter how awful the content was, even though games like this reinforce the religious view of impure women being a burden or an object not to be seen or cared for, and view as a suitable punishment for those women. Blaming people's concern to be a logic of conservative fear-mongering only works if you ignore the context and motivation. For example, religious people who are still homophobic in the Big 25 compare being gay to being a zoophile. Like, surprisingly, a lot of people still do that in the Big 25 apparently. But some people truly think that society accepts that bestiality is wrong because some holy texts say so, and believe that other people are being hypocrites and not following other God's words because you're following God's word of not animals, so why do you not follow his word on consenting queer adults? Not understanding that a lot of people don't pay attention to religious rules at all when considering their morals. The reason society broadly treats zoophilia as both a modern social and legal rule, but not based in ancient religious texts, is because they believe in the scientific and ethical reasoning that states that animals cannot give consent, which makes any sexual act involving them a form of abuse. Historical religious texts prohibited bestiality as a way of distinguishing certain communities from surrounding cultural practices at the time, while modern ethical standards focus on harm, consent, and autonomy. Both yield the same result of people agreeing that sexually assaulting animals is wrong, but they have different reasonings of why. One relies on dogma or divine authority, which is accepted without evidence, while the other is grounded in contemporary ethics, science, and widely agreed upon standards of harm and consent. People can have progressive, feminist, sex-positive reasons to be against certain types of and other people can have flag and faith, conservative, billionaire, bootlicking reasons for condemning the same kind of. That doesn't mean that either are grifters for agreeing on something. But an important thing to keep in mind when certain religious powerful people become aware that modern secular ethics hold more sway in public discourse, they begin to repackage their religiously motivated beliefs as scientific to maintain credibility. Historically, they've used fake science to justify racism, condemn homosexuality, promoted conversion therapy, cherry-picked health data, and just straight up make up shit about real people. As quoted by many people, the numbers don't lie, but people with the numbers do. While I was trying to find any study, peer-reviewed article, research-based document that was related to adult content, or more specifically BDSM adult content, it was extremely hard to find anything positive. While I was looking up a bunch of sources, I found this research document that was compiled over a ton of sources that was made from somebody from the addiction subreddit. As I was reading, it became very apparent that it wasn't really much of a research document on because it included a lot of personal bias between the notes. To be clear, the sources that were in the document were for the most part reliable, but when I was reading the propaganda section, I was surprised that a supposed research document on didn't include the propaganda that fuels purity culture that often pushes people into porn addiction in the first place due to teaching that any sexual thought or behavior is deeply shameful, which paradoxically makes sexual content more psychologically compelling. When people are told that their sexual desires are inherently wrong or dangerous without even exploring the context of their fantasies, they often develop an unhealthy relationship with their sexuality that can manifest as compulsive behavior, especially when they aren't offered an alternative or even a healthy education about normal sexuality, leaving people without the resources to understand or manage their sexual feelings in healthy ways. They even mention how it's annoying that any condemnation around is automatically dismissed to have religious or Puritan agenda, which is true. That's accurate. It is annoying, but why do you think that people immediately jump to that defense in the first place? If the document was an opinion piece, I wouldn't have cared because people voice their opinions and show the reasons why they believe in such things. But then again, I also don't think I would have read it if I knew it was opinion-based because, hello, I only care about my own biased opinion, thank you. Anytime I tried to search up anything positive about a common result would always just be false sex education from religious sites. The sites I'd see weren't typically obviously advertised to be religious either. Whenever I'd find an article, I'd have to press Ctrl F in my browser, and if any of the words gospel, Bible, Jesus, or holy showed up, I dismissed it completely. I also do that with first-person pronouns and so-called unbiased, reliable resources because we hate pronouns on this channel. That's not to say that their opinions are invalid, but these articles were passed off to be on the same basis of scientific peer-reviewed articles and research that just felt dishonest about their real intent, especially when it was just always about slut-shaming women specifically. Like this one article I found that immediately had a first-person pronoun, but I still wanted to hear them out. The article was about women consuming erotica and how it's on the same line as visual, video, or picture. Scientifically, that's wrong, but it is true that erotica often gets skipped in conversations around porn addictions because people can still get addicted to it. However, when I was reading it, I was super confused because in the beginning of their article, they say nothing but good things about women reading erotica. But when I got to the end, I spotted the line, perceived improvements in some areas of life do not necessarily mean that the same results and excitement could not happen within other forms of sexual education, more in line with the gospel of course. Despite it being mostly obviously informal, they still use a lot of academic sounding language about research and studies and open up their article with seemingly objective observations about the publishing industry, but then just discredits everything they said with the article pivoting to religion. Again, I have no problem with people following a religion by itself, but presenting religious beliefs as deep scientific analysis, these pieces encourage people to internalize shame about their sexuality while feeling intellectually justified. When someone reads that their sexual interests are detrimental and deteriorative, fluffed up in academic language, it carries more weight than obvious religious condemnation. And it was so weird too because it acknowledged all the positive experiences that women get from erotica. Better communication, increased satisfaction, bodily autonomy, but then reframes those exact same benefits as problems. It just feels so saddening to think that this is just a bait and switch. The author understands how you feel, meaning that they really know how to make you feel like a bad person for having positive feelings around consensual. It sets up a false choice between gospel-aligned sexuality and deteriorative alternatives while getting rid of any possibility that healthy sexuality might exist outside of what they've presented, which forces people to choose between their authentic experiences and their faith community's approval. And I can't believe that this article that perpetuates purity culture is targeted at women. I can't believe it. I've never seen that before. The fact that I got this article when I was trying to find the positive messaging around just means that this result shows up for women who are most likely seeking sexual education and empowerment. But this article intercepts their searches with content that appears helpful, but ultimately reinforces the idea that their sexual autonomy is dangerous. This strange difficulty finding balance research actually reflects on a lot of valid problems in this field specifically. The research on is more often than not genuinely skewed due to publication and funding bias, especially since it's a bit hard to do experiments surrounding ethically. So researchers have to rely on surveys, correlation studies, and other methods that are much more open to interpretation and bias. This makes the field even more susceptible to ideological manipulation because it's easier to spin ambiguous results to fit whatever narrative you're pushing. A very fake and not real analogy is if I had a company that was funded by billionaire fracking tycoons, and I made educational videos about how climate change isn't real and everyone wrong in the world is actually because of poor people and trans people and not the super elites. You will probably get very one-sided results. Studies that show neutral or positive effects are less likely to receive funding, get published, or appear in search results, while studies that show the negative or harmful effects are more likely to get those things because they generate more citations and attention, especially with the amount of religious and ideological-driven organizations producing seemingly scientific articles without clear discourse, which hide conflicts of interest. I didn't even realize how biased the research I found was until the second time that I covered this topic, when I found the research document on and got suspicious of how one-sided it appeared. But what made me more sure of my position the first time was when I talked about this topic of adult sexual content, and when people disagreed with me, they didn't cite any sources that backed up what they believed what they did. It was typically vague insults to my intelligence and expressing disappointment that I would fall for pseudoscience, even when the things I cited were from psychology and media theory studies. I know the things that I cited were very one-sided, but I had nothing else to work off of. I encourage you to be a skeptic, to think critically about everything that you hear online, and to impressively nitpick everything I'm saying and showing to make sure it's accurate, because there is so much false information and sometimes it slips past me or I fall for it. But there gets to a point where skepticism just looks like lunacy when you refuse to back up your claims with evidence while plugging your ears going la la la, just because my opinion isn't on the side that you are on. The burden of proof is on those making the claims to actually provide that proof, not just dismiss everything they disagree with as pseudoscience while offering nothing in return. I'm sure that balanced research does exist, but sometimes it uses different language than someone googling this topic for some reason didn't think of trying, or it's often buried in specialized journals, or just presents more nuanced conclusions that don't make compelling titles that don't use the word gooner for some strange reason. I would love to say that is awesome and nothing wrong could come out of it ever, but I'd also like to think that I've grown out of that phase in my life. I want my takes to be logical and based in facts, but if you have facts that I'm missing, then I want them included too, even if it makes the conversation more complicated and or outright makes me wrong. But I don't know, that's just me. Laters.